Episode 80, July the 4th to July the 12th, 1915. My Escape from an English Prison Camp by Gunther Plüschow. Read by Linus Claassen. On the outbreak of the war, the writer of this chapter, Herr Plüschow, was a naval flying officer at Kiao-Chou, China. Escaping in his aeroplane during the siege of that town in November 1914, he sailed from New York in January 1915. Identified and taken prisoner at Gibraltar, he was taken to England and interned at Donington Hall. Here, as a counterpart to other stories of bold English escapes from German camps, is Herr Plüschow's own story of his remarkable escape in July 1915 to Germany. After many thrilling adventures in China and America during the first year of the war, I attempted to get back to Germany from New York disguised as a Swiss on an Italian steamer in February 1915. But I was discovered and arrested at Gibraltar by the British authorities and eventually found myself in the German officers' prison camp at Donington Hall, near Derby. Day and night I planned, brooded, deliberated how I could escape from this miserable imprisonment. I had to act with the greatest calm and caution if I hoped to succeed. For hours I walked up and down in front of different parts of the entanglements, while I unostentatiously examined every wire and every stake. For hours together I lay in the grass in the vicinity of some of those spots that seemed favorable, feigning sleep. But all the time I was closely watching every object and noting the ways and habits of the different sentries. I had already fixed upon the spot where I had decided to climb the barbed wire. Now the question remained how to make headway after this obstacle had been overcome. We possessed neither a map of England nor a compass, no timetable, no means of assistance of any kind. I resolved to make common cause with a naval officer, Oberleutnant Ch12, who knew England and spoke English remarkably well. On the 4th of July 1915 in the morning, we reported ourselves sick. At the morning roll call at 10 o'clock, our names were entered on the sick list, and on its completion, the orderly sergeant came to our room and found us ill in bed. Everything was working well. With the afternoon came the decision. About 4 p.m., I dressed, collected all that I considered necessary for my flight, ate several substantial buttered rolls, and bade farewell to my comrades. A heavy storm was in progress, and rain poured in torrents from grey skies. The sentries stood wet and shivering in their sentry boxes, and therefore nobody paid any attention when two officers decided to walk about in the park in spite of the rain. The park contained a grotto, surrounded by shrubs, from which one could overlook its whole expanse and the barbed wire, without oneself being seen. This is where Ch12 and I crept in. From now onwards, we were in the hands of Providence, and it was to be hoped that fortune would not forsake us. We waited in breathless suspense. Minutes seemed like centuries, but slowly and surely 1 hour passed after another, until the turret clock struck 6 in loud, clear chimes. Our hearts thumped in unison. We heard the bell ring for roll call, the command "Attention," and then the noisy closing of the day boundary. We hardly dared to breathe, expecting at any moment to hear our names called out. It was 6:30, and nothing had happened. A weight slipped from our shoulders. Thank God, the first act was a success. For during the roll call, our names had again been reported on the sick list, and as soon as the officers were allowed to fall out, 2 of our comrades raced back as swiftly as they could through the back entrance and occupied Ch12's bed and mine. Therefore, when the sergeant arrived, he was able to account satisfactorily for the 2 invalids. As everything was now in order, the night boundary was closed, as every night, and even the sentries withdrawn from the day boundary. Thus, we were left to our own devices. The exceptionally heavy rain proved a boon to us, for the English soldiers generally indulged in all kinds of frolic in the evenings, and we might have easily been discovered. At 10:30 p.m., our excitement came to a head. We had to pass our second test. We clearly heard the signal "Stand to," and from the open window of my former room, the watch on the Rhine rang out sonorously. It was the concerted signal that all were on the alert. The orderly officer, accompanied by a sergeant, walked through all the rooms and satisfied himself that no one was missing. By observations carried on for weeks, I had made sure that the orderly officers always chose the same route in order to return to their quarters after their rounds by the shortest way. So it was tonight. The round began with the room from which Ch12 was missing. Of course, his bed was already occupied by someone. All present? Yes, sir. All right. Good night, gentlemen. And so forth. As soon as the orderly officer had turned the corner, two other comrades ran in the opposite direction and into my room, so that here also all could be reported present. It is difficult to conceive our nervous tension while this was in progress. We followed all the proceedings in our minds, and when suddenly silence supervened for an unconscionably lengthy period, we feared the worst. With ice-cold hands, ears on the alert for the slightest sound, we lay, hardly daring to breathe. At last, at 11 p.m., a lusty cheer broke the stillness. It was our concerted signal that all was clear. The moment for action had arrived. I crept softly as a cat from my hiding place, through the park up to the barbed wire fence, to convince myself that no sentries were about. When I saw that everything was in order and had found the exact spot where we wanted to climb over, I crawled back again to fetch Ch12. Thereupon, we returned by the same way. When we reached the fence, I gave Ch12 my final instructions and handed him my small bundle. I was the first to climb over the fence, which was about 9 feet high, and every 8 inches the wire was covered with long spikes. Wires charged with electricity were placed 2.5 feet from the ground. A mere touch would have sufficed to set in motion a system of bells that would, of course, have given the alarm to the whole camp. We wore leather leggings as protection against the spikes. Round our knees we had puttees, and we wore leather gloves. I easily swung myself over the first fence. Ch12 handed over our 2 bundles and followed me with equal ease. Next, we were confronted by a wire obstacle, 3 feet high by 30 feet wide, contrived according to the latest and most cunning devices. We ran over it like cats. After this, we again came to a high barbed wire hedge, built on exactly the same lines as the first and also electrically charged. We managed this too, except that I tore a piece out of the seat of my trousers, which I had to retrieve in order to put it in again later. But, thank God, we were over the boundary. Ch12 and I clasped hands and looked at each other in silence. But now the chief difficulty began. We opened our bundles, took out civilian grey mackintoshes, and walked down the road in high spirits, as if we were coming from a late entertainment. Suddenly, just as we were turning into the village, an English soldier came walking towards us. Ch12 embraced me, drew me towards him, and we behaved like a rollicking pair of lovebirds. The Englishman surveyed us enviously and went on his way, clicking his tongue. Only then, something in the stocky, undersized figure made me realize that it was the sergeant major of our camp. We stepped out briskly, but we were at once confronted with a critical proposition. The highway branched off in 3 directions, and it was impossible to get any farther without knowledge of the road. At last, in spite of the darkness, we discovered a signpost, and when Ch12 had climbed it, he was able to feel with his fingers the word "derb" traced on it in raised letters. We now fell into a quick step and, taking our bearings by the polar star, swung along vigorously. Gradually dawn came. About 4 in the morning, when we arrived within sight of the first houses of Derby suburbs, the sun rose in majestic splendor, like a crimson ball on the horizon. We now crept into a small garden and made an elaborate toilet. A clothes brush performed miracles, and a needle repaired the damage done to my trousers. The lack of shaving soap was remedied by spittle, after which our poor faces were subjected to the ministrations of a Gillette razor. We each sported our solitary collar and tie, leaving the brush as well as other unnecessary impedimenta behind us. We entered Derby looking veritable knots. Our luck endured, and not only did we soon find the station, where we separated unobtrusively, but we also learned that the next train for London was leaving in a quarter of an hour. I took a third-class return ticket to Leicester, and armed with a fat newspaper, boarded the train. At Leicester, I got out and took a ticket to London. About noon, the train reached London. When I passed the ticket collector, I must admit that I did not feel quite comfortable, and that my hand shook a little, but nothing happened, and after a few minutes I was swallowed up in the vortex of the capital. At 7 o'clock in the evening, I stood weary and downcast on the steps of St. Paul's Cathedral, waiting for Trefts. I waited until 9, but no Trefts appeared. Convinced that Trefts had already managed his escape on a friendly steamer, I dragged myself, totally exhausted, to Hyde Park, which, to my further discomfiture, I found closed. What should I do now? Where should I sleep? I turned into an aristocratic lane, where beautiful mansions were surrounded by carefully tended gardens. I was hardly able to stand on my feet, and at the first favorable moment, I jumped with quick decision over one of the garden fences, and hid myself in a thick box hedge, only a foot away from the pavement. After I had lain for about an hour in my refuge, the French window of the house, leading to a beautiful veranda, opened, and several ladies and gentlemen in evening dress came out to enjoy the coolness of the night. I could see them and hear every word. Soon the sounds of a piano mingled with those of a splendid soprano voice, and the most wonderful songs of Schubert overwhelmed my soul with longing. At last, total exhaustion prevailed, and I slept heavily, seeing in my mind the most beautiful pictures of the future. Next morning I was awakened by the regular tread of a policeman who marched up and down the street, quite close to where I lay, with the bright warm rays of the sun shining down upon me. So after all I had overslept, it behoved me to be careful. The policeman ambled idiotically up and down without dreaming of departure. At last, fortune favored me. An enchanting little lady's maid opened the door, and hey presto! The policeman was at her side, playfully conversing with the pretty dear. Without being seen by either, with a quick motion, I vaulted over the fence into the street. It was already 6 o'clock, and Hyde Park was just being opened. As the underground was not yet running, I went into the park and dropped full length on a bench near to other vagabonds who had made themselves comfortable there. I then pulled my hat over my face and slept profoundly until 9 o'clock. With fresh strength and courage, I entered the underground and was carried to the harbor area. In the Strand, huge yellow posters attracted my attention, and who can describe my astonishment when I read on them, printed in big fat letters, that first, Mr. Trefts had been recaptured the evening before, second, Mr. Plüschow was still at large, but that third, the police were already on his track. The first and third items were news, but I knew all about the second. I promptly bought a newspaper, went into a tea shop, where I read with great interest the notice. Poor Trefts, so they had got him. I was clear in my mind as to what I was going to do, and the warrant gave me some valuable points. First, I had to get rid of my mackintosh. I therefore went to Blackfriars Station and left my overcoat in the cloakroom. As I handed the garment over, the clerk suddenly asked me, "What is your name, sir?" Tilt's question absolutely bowled me over, as I was quite unprepared for it. With shaking knees, I asked, "Meinen?" answering in German as I naturally presumed that the man had guessed my identity. "Oh, I see, Mr. Mine, M-I-N-E." And he handed me a receipt in the name of Mr. Mine. It was a miracle that this official had not noticed my terror, and I felt particularly uncomfortable when I had to pass the two policemen, who stood on guard at the station, and who scrutinized me sharply. I now sought a quiet, solitary spot. My beautiful soft hat fell accidentally into the river from London Bridge. Collar and tie followed suit from another spot. A beautiful gilt stud held my green shirt together. After that, a mixture of Vaseline, bootblack, and coal dust turned my blonde hair black and greasy. My hands soon looked as if they had never made acquaintance with water, and at last I wallowed in a coal heap until I had turned into a perfect prototype of the dock laborer on strike. In this guise it was quite impossible to suspect me of being an officer, and smart and dapper were the last words anyone could have possibly applied to me. For days I loafed about London. My cap sat jauntily at the back of my head, my jacket open, showing my blue sweater and its one ornament, the gilt stud, hands in pocket, whistling and spitting, as is the custom of sailors in ports all the world over. On the second morning, I had colossal luck. I sat on the top of a bus, and behind me 2 businessmen were engaged in animated conversation. Suddenly I caught the words, "Dutch steamer, departure, Tilbury." These careless gentlemen were recounting nothing less than the momentous news of the sailing, each morning at 7, of a fast Dutch steamer for Flushing, which cast anchor off Tilbury docks every afternoon. In the twinkling of an eye, I was off the bus. I rushed off to Blackfriars Station, and, an hour later, was at Tilbury. I went down to the riverside, threw myself on the grass, and, feigning sleep, kept a lynx-eyed watch. Ship after ship went by, and my expectations rose every minute. At last, at 4 p.m., with proud bearing, the fast Dutch steamer dropped anchor and made fast to a buoy just in front of me. My happiness and my joy were indescribable when I read the ship's name, in white shining letters on the bow, Mecklenburg. There could be no better omen for me, since I am a native of Mecklenburg-Schwerin. I crossed over to Gravesend on a ferry boat, and from there unobtrusively watched the steamer. This was my plan: to swim to the buoy during the night, climb the hawser, creep on deck, and reach Holland as a stowaway. I soon found the basis for my operations. After I had ascertained that nobody was paying any attention to me, I climbed over a pile of wood and rubbish and concealed myself under some planks, where I discovered several bundles of hay. These afforded me a warm resting place, of which I made use on that and the following nights. About midnight I left my refuge. However, I perceived with dismay that 2 barges which, in daytime, had been nearly submerged, lay high and dry. Luckily, at the stern, a little dinghy rode on the water. With prompt resolution, I wanted to rush into the boat, but before I knew where I was, I felt the ground slipping from under my feet, and I sank to the hips into a squashy, slimy, stinking mass. I threw my arms about and was just able to reach the plank which ran from the shore to the sailing boat with my left hand. It took all my strength to get free of the slime, which had nearly proved my undoing, and I was completely exhausted when I at last dragged myself back to my bed of hay. When the sun rose on the 3rd morning of my escape, I had already returned to a bench in Gravesend Park and was watching the Mecklenburg as she slipped her moorings at 7 a.m. and made for the open sea. The next day, I walked up to London on foot from Gravesend and returned by the other side of the Thames to Tilbury. All this in order to find a boat that I could purloin unnoticed. Several lay there as if waiting for me, but they were only too well guarded. I gave it up in despair. That evening I went to a music hall with the firm intention of blowing my last pound, and then caught the last train to Tilbury. After I had passed the first fishermen's huts of Gravesend, I found a small scull. I took it with me. In midstream, just near the landing place of the fishing vessels, a little dinghy bobbed on the water. Not more than 20 feet away sat their owners on a bench, so absorbed in tender flirtation with their fair ones that the good sea folk took no heed of my appearance on the scene. It was risky, but nothing venture, nothing have, I muttered to myself, and thanks to my acquired proficiency, crept soundlessly into the boat. One sharp cut, and the tiny nutshell softly glided alongside a fishing boat, on whose quarterdeck a woman was lulling her baby to sleep. As there were no rowlocks in the boat, I sat aft, and pushed off with all my strength from the shore. I had, however, hardly covered 1/3 of the distance, when the ebb tide caught me in its whirl, spun my boat round like a top, and paralyzed all my efforts at steering. The time had come to show my sailor's efficiency. With an iron grip, I recovered control of the boat, and, floating with the tide, I steered a downstream course. An imposing military pontoon bridge, stretching across the river and guarded by soldiers, came across my way. Summoning cool resolution and sharp attention to my aid, looking straight ahead and only intent on my scull, I disregarded the sentry's challenge and shot through between the two pontoons. A few sea-ons after the boat sustained a heavy shock, and I floundered onto the anchor cable of a mighty coal tender. With lightning speed, I flung my paint around it, and this just in time, for the boat nearly capsized. But I was safe. My steamer lay to the starboard. I wanted to bide my time until the flow of the tide made it possible for me to get across. At last the sun rose, and still the water ran out so strongly that it was impossible to carry out my flight just then. But at last, happy in the possession of the long-desired boat, I slid downstream and, after an hour, pulled up at a crumbling old bridge on the right bank of the Thames. I pushed my boat under it, took both sculls with me as a precautionary measure, and hid them in the long grass. Then I lay down close to them, and at 8 o'clock I saw my steamer, the Mecklenburg, vanishing proudly before my eyes. My patience had still to undergo a severe test. I remained lying in the grass for the next 16 hours, until, at 8 o'clock that night, the hour of my deliverance struck. I again entered my boat. Cautiously, I allowed myself to be driven upstream by the incoming tide, and fastened my boat to the same coal tender near which I had been stranded the night before. Athwart, to me, lay the Princess Juliana moored to her buoy. At midnight all was still around me, and when at 1 o'clock the boat was quietly bobbing on the floe, I cast off, sat up in my boat, and rowed, with as much self-possession as if I had been one of a Sunday party in Kiel Harbor, to the steamer. Unnoticed I reached the buoy. The black hull of my steamer towered high above me, a strong pull, and I was atop the buoy. I now bade farewell to my faithful swan with a sound kick, which set it off downstream with the start of the ebb. During the next few minutes I lay as silent as a mouse. Then I climbed with iron composure, and this time, like a cat, the mighty steel cable to the hawse. Cautiously I leaned over the rail and spied about. The forecastle was empty. I jerked myself upwards and stood on the deck. I now crept along the deck to the capstan, and hid in the oil-save-all beneath the windlass. As all remained quiet, and not a soul hove in sight, I climbed out of my nook, took off my boots, and stowed them away under a stack of timber in the corner of the foredeck. I now proceeded to investigate in my stockinged feet. When I looked down, from a corner astern, the foredeck to the cargo deck, I staggered back suddenly. Breathlessly, but without turning a hair, I remained leaning against the ventilator. Below, on the cargo deck, stood 2 sentries, who were staring fixedly upwards. After I had remained for over half an hour in this cramped position, and my knees were beginning to knock under, there tripped 2 stewardesses from the middle deck. They were apparently coming off night duty. My two sentries immediately seized the golden moment and became absorbed in their conversation, that they no longer paid any attention to what was going on around them. The dawn was breaking, and I had to act at once if I was not to lose all I had achieved at such a price. I let myself down along the counter on the side of the foredeck opposite to the two loving couples and landed on the cargo deck. Without pausing for a moment, I stepped out gently, glided past the two sentries, reached the promenade deck safely, and, climbing up a deck pillar, found myself shortly afterwards on the outboard side of a lifeboat, holding on with one hand with a grip of iron, for the Thames was lapping hungrily, not 12 yards away. With my other, aided by my teeth, I tore open a few of the tapes of the boat cover, and with a last output of strength I crept through the small gap and crouched, well hidden from curious eyes, into the interior of the boat. And then, naturally, I came to the end of my endurance. The prodigious physical exertions, acute excitement, and last, but not least, my ravenous hunger, stretched me flat on the boards of the boat, and in the same moment I no longer knew what was going on around me. Shrill blasts from the siren woke me from a sleep which in its dreamlessness resembled death. I prudently loosened the tapes of my boat cover, and with difficulty suppressed a hurrah, for the steamer was running into the harbor of Flushing. With a deep breath I stood in the middle of the boat deck and expected to be made a prisoner at any moment. But no one bothered about me. The crew was occupied with landing maneuvers, the travelers with their luggage. Then I mixed with the crowd, and while the passengers were being subjected to a strict control, I looked around, and near the railings discovered a door, on which stood in large letters, "Exit forbidden." There surely lay the way to freedom. In the twinkling of an eye, I negotiated this childishly easy obstacle, and stood without. I was free. After I had bought a few small necessaries, on the next day, I boarded a slow train for Germany, wearing workman's clothes. I was quite unable to sit still for long. Alone in my first-class compartment, I was overwhelmed by the thoughts and hopes which raced through my brain. I ran about my railway carriage, like a wild animal in a cage. At last! It seemed an eternity. The train passed slowly over the German frontier.
I go